Rupa kadamahyam dadati swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yutapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Shri Rupam Sagrajaitam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saritam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakan Vitam Madeka Bando Matsangen Man Guru Man Mahadana Man Nistarakamat Bhavananda Namostute. Hare Krishna. 7th Canto, Chapter 2. Yudhishthira Maharaj has asked a question concerning the hatred of Hiranyakashipu for his son, Prahlad Maharaj. Generally, the demons are completely absorbed in the I and my conception of life. So it naturally follows that the son should be dear to the father because of the bodily concept of life. And yet it is saying that Hiranyakashipu had profound animosity for his own son, Prahlad Maharaj. So in this chapter, Narada Muni begins to give explanation why that is the case. In short, the answer is because of hatred of Vishnu. So he had hatred for the son who was devoted to Vishnu. And so how that hatred of Vishnu was born is described in this particular chapter. So in the first passage, which is basically verses 1 through up to verse 19, I'm just going to give a little gloss. What Narada Muni begins to describe there is that Hiranyaksha, the younger brother of Hiranyakashipu, was killed by Vishnu and his Varaha avatar manifestation, the boar avatar manifestation. So from that point, Hiranyakashipu developed profound animosity for Vishnu because his brother was very dear to him. Again, the I and mind concept. So he proceeds to address an army of Asuras, and he explains to them that he wants to kill Vishnu. Interestingly enough, in his explanations there, he has some awareness of the nature of Vishnu. He speaks to Vishnu being neutral, actually, having equality for all living entities, being the Paramatma. Samoham sarvabhuteshu name dveshasti napriya. Even though that is his nature, he has given up his nature due to Maya. That is his thinking. His nature is to be equal to all living entities. But due to Maya, he has given up that nature. And like a child who can be manipulated by offering the candy. So the Devatas, they have worshipped Vishnu, which is like an offering of candy, and have caused Vishnu to give up his nature of equality. So this is all due to the Maya, due to ignorance. So he thinks that God, like the ordinary living entity, can come under the influence of Maya. Or our commentators say the word Maya means mercy. So Vishnu is certainly equal, but by his mercy, he becomes partial to the bhaktas. In any case, so he says he wants to kill Vishnu. And he makes promise to the army of Asuras that he's addressing that he himself will take up the task of killing Vishnu. But they should assist him in his work. So he advises them to go down to earth and begin to destroy the Vedic culture, specifically Brahminical culture and the Kshatriyas who support Brahminical culture. And in this way, by stopping the ceremonies of the Vedas, especially Yagya, because Yagya is Vishnu. Yagya Bhai Vishnu. So the word Yagya, which means sacrifice, means Vishnu. And the word sacrifice itself means to make something complete or whole. The idea is that when we take from nature, then we have to give back in order to keep it whole. This is the process of Yagya. So the Supreme Lord has made an arrangement between heaven and earth. On the earth, there are the jivas who are to perform offerings to the devatas who are living in heaven. And this relationship between heaven and earth, the currency is yajna. And so by doing the yajna, the devatas will supply the various material resources required on the earth plane, and they get the benefits of the yajna, the various oblations. So this is the system that God has arranged for the universe. So he's saying that you should go down to the earth and stop all the sacrifices, stop all the yajna. And by destroying yajna, specifically by destroying the the brahmanas and the kshatriyas who will be devoted to Vishnu, who perform the yajna, then Vishnu himself will be killed. This is his thinking. Because if you cut down the root of a tree, then all the branches and the leaves, they will dry up due to malnourishment. So similarly, if you cut or kill the brahmanas and the kshatriyas, you kill the Vedic culture, you kill the sacrifices, then Vishnu himself will be killed in this way. So obviously in this conception, he believes that Vishnu is himself dependent upon yajna, like the devatas. The devatas are themselves dependent on yajna. So he thinks Vishnu is like that. So if you stop the yajna, then you in effect are basically killing Vishnu and killing the devatas also. So religious people will always be a target of persecution for the asuric class of man, especially when they're doing their program of world domination, which is a very old trope in media, movies, and so on. You know, I grew up on this TV show called The Animaniacs, one cartoon, and there was, I forget the name of the character, the Brainiac, and his whole program was conquering the world. This is a very old trope that you'll encounter in all media. We have to conquer the world. Most of the asuras depicted in movies today have the same program: conquer the world, conquer the world, conquer the world. So in order to do that successfully, then they have to stop the culture of God consciousness, where people are living, living in accordance with the laws of God naturally, and therefore will not be susceptible to the various programs of manipulation that are required for world domination. So he tells all the demons, you go and kill all these Vaishnavas, you kill all these Brahmanas, you kill the Kshatriyas, you stop Vedic culture, you destroy the trees that give the various substances required for yajna, you kill cows. All these programs that are meant to nourish the Vedic culture and nourish yajna and thereby worship Vishnu, you destroy everything. And I myself will take up the task of destroying Vishnu. So all the asuras, because they are already having natural inclination to destructive work due to the Rajas and Tamas force being dominant in their psychology, they are very excited, yay. And so they go down to earth and they begin their destructive program. And because they had stopped Vedic culture, the devatas were not receiving any of their oblations, which was causing some difficulty in heaven. As we mentioned, the currency between heaven and earth is the yajna. So the devatas, they descend to earth in disguise to see what is taking place. And of course, they see there is mass destruction going on. And they become very much, of course, afraid. I don't know if that part of the story is continued here, I forgot. So while this is going on, Hiranyakashipu begins to address his family members who are extremely distraught from the death of Hiranyaksha. Again, Hiranyaksha is the younger brother. His younger brother, and of course he was also someone's son, someone's husband, etc. So he addresses all the wives that are left behind, the brother that is left behind, the mother that is left behind, his family members. He addresses them in order to remove their lamentation by knowledge. Now he himself is completely under the influence of lamentation, and his lamentation has transformed into destructive energy. The whole instruction to destroy earth is due to lamentation, actually. He doesn't know how to how to hold that experience. And this is the big dilemma of the jiva in the material world. How do we hold lamentation and transform that energy into spiritual life, basically? Most of entities, we don't have the knowledge by which we can transmute that energy into something that isn't either self-destructive or other destructive. That energy usually transforms into a sort of nihilism, where one embraces self-destruction or destruction of others. That is what is normally seen. As we often like to point out in these classes, that the whole Bhagavad Gita is book framed around the topic of lamentation, because Krishna's very first instruction, Ashocana Vashocastvam, that you are lamenting for that which is not worthy of lamentation. This is his very first statement in his teachings. And his very last statement in his teaching is Ma Shuchaha, which means don't lament. So the whole teaching is kind of book framed around the subject matter of lamentation, speaking to the lamentation being the main dilemma of the jiva. And so the Bhagavad Gita is intended as an answer to the problem of lamentation. And I'm speaking of lamentation as a type of energy. So that energy can either cause self-destruction or other destruction, as what is taking place in the narration here, or it can be transformed into spiritual life. But in order for that to happen, one needs a certain type of knowledge. So Krishna speaks to Bhagavad Gita, secret, most secret knowledge, by which one can take that energy and transmute it into something beautiful. Otherwise, if you're in the ignorance, you don't know how to do that. And so it turns into destructive force. So Hiranyakashipu, himself overwhelmed by lamentation, has taken that energy and transformed it into destructive force. But now he goes and addresses his family members with diplomacy. That is what I think Prabhupada has used it that way. With a diplomacy. And diplomacy, even though he himself is under the sway of lamentation, he will now instruct his family members why they should not be under the sway of lamentation. And he wants to give them certain knowledge by which they could be successful in either transmuting that energy or at least holding that energy in a way that it doesn't destroy them. And so starting with verse 20 to 27, well, to the end of the chapter, but we're going to look at 20 and 27 briefly here. Hiranyakashipu addresses his family members with a certain type of knowledge by which he hopes to pacify them. Just as another small note, it seems to be the standard practice, at least in the old world, that when people were dealing with lamentation, that they would be instructed about, knowledge of the Atman and knowledge of how the Atman is entangled in the forces of karma in the material world. And this was used as a palliative when encountering, suffering. Nowadays, this would be considered as insensitive. When people are suffering and you just say, well, you're not the body, and this is considered somewhat insensitive. But actually, this was a standard method of pacifying that energy and transforming it. So now we look at verse 20 to 27. Hiranyakashipu is now trying to give some reasonable instruction as a form of diplomacy. He's a diplomat, so he's speaking this way while hypocritically. He's speaking this way hypocritically, for he himself is also under the same energy and could really benefit from this advice. So this is the first verse of the passage. This is verse 27 to 20. Abamba hevadhu putra vera mahatta shochitum ripor abhimuke shlagya shuranam vada ipsita. Hiranyakashipu said, my dear mother, sister-in-law, and nephews, you should not lament for the death of the great hero. For a hero's death in front of his enemy is glorious and most desirable. So there are warriors. So for warriors who die on the battlefield is considered a glorious thing. There are basically two types of glorious death. This was mentioned earlier in 6th Canto. We heard it in relationship to the Vishwasura Lila. One type of glorious death is when you die in the samadhi. For those who take up the spiritual path and they attain samadhi and they die in the absorption of divinity. This is a glorious death. And the other type of glorious death is to die on the battlefield, according to the rules of governing combat. Then you die on the battlefield, and either you'll attain, at least you'll get Swargaloka from that. So this was also considered a type of glorious death. So first he gives them some sort of conventional knowledge shared based on the Vedas, that this was actually a very glorious thing. That's what he wants to tell to them. And the next verse, Bhutanam iha samphasa, prapayam iva suvrate, dave naikatra nitanam unitanam swakarmabi. This is a very nice verse. My dear mother, in a restaurant or place for drinking cold water, many travelers are brought together, and after drinking water, they continue to their respective destinations. Similarly, living entities join together in a family, and later, as a result of their own actions, they are led apart to their destination. This is a very nice verse. Bhutanam iha samvasa. So living entities in this world, samvasa. Samvasa means vasa means like to stay or to live, like Brajavas, living in Braj. Samvasa, they come to live together. Living entities here in this world, they come to live together. And he says, this is prapayam eva. This is just like people coming together at a drinking fountain. Of course, this is a little bit culturally relatable in the present time, but in the old time, I guess when there would be traveling going on, one of the types of pious activities that one can do is build a well on the road of travel. And while traveling, people can take a little pit stop, just like when you're on the road trip and they have like the little rest area. And then at the pit stop, you can go and drink some water. And then after that, you continue on your journey. So prapayam eva means like this well that is meant for drinking water. Someone is traveling, so you come to the drinking fountain, someone else also comes to the drinking fountain. And maybe while you're there drinking water, you may start some conversation. You may come to be related to each other in a particular way for 5 or 10 minutes, and then you go your separate ways, never to meet again. Or just like when you get on the airplane or some long bus travel, you may sit with so many people, and maybe you strike up a conversation with someone, and the conversation is very nice, and you feel like even you're good friends. And then after you get to the destination, you depart, never to see each other again. So living entities in this world, they come to live together as husband and wife, as brothers, as cousins, etc. They come together in one spot. But he says this is just like people stopping at the drinking fountain when traveling. Daivena ekatra nitanam unitanam swakarma bihi. By daiva, so daiva, the word daiva means karmic inheritance. And we all come into this material world with a certain sort of fate. Daiva. Daiva means a certain type of birth you'll have, a certain type of life experience, and a certain time of death. These things are basically fated. This is called as daiva. So by daiva, by the force of daiva, ekatra nitanam unitanam. So nitanam means people are brought together. Unitanam means people are separated. So they come together in one spot, and then they're separated from that one spot due to the force of daiva. And this is all due to swakarma bihi, by their own actions. That means previously we've done certain actions, and so that has generated a certain type of fruit. And the fruit is just now coming, so that is called daiva. So by the force of daiva, we come as friends or family, and then by the same force of daiva, we are separated. So this is called fate, and no living entity in this world can escape his fate any more than a bird can escape from flying. A living entity cannot escape his fate. A lot of human life today is centered around trying to avoid fate. But in their attempts to do so, they only add more suffering to suffering. Prahlad Maharaj is saying that the remedy for suffering that they find is itself suffering. And Narayana Muni gives a nice image of this. He says it is just like if you have one rock on the shoulder, so then your shoulder starts to hurt, so you transfer the rock to the head. So your shoulder gets a little bit relief, but the rock is still there. So after some time, the rock starts to hurt your head. So then you transfer it from the head to the other shoulder. And then you feel some temporary relief, but then the next shoulder is hurting. The only real solution is to get rid of the rock. But as long as you're holding the rock there, actually, you've not solved the problem. So living entities like this and their attempts for counteracting fate, they're just shifting around the burden, actually, from one situation to the next. And oftentimes in their program of counteraction, they're actually augmenting their dukkha. Dukkho shadam ta'api dukkham. Their remedy for dukkha is itself dukkha. This is the situation. So the way we're instructed by, sacred text, Shastra, to encounter fate is to endure it. What is that? Tanta tikshu sabharata matra sparshastu konteya shitosha sukudukha. Daha agama apayino nityas tanta tikshu sabharata. This is a very simple verse of the Bhagavad Gita, but it's a very kind of important, powerful verse in one sense. How do we deal with fate? Fate means the inexorable suffering that there's nothing we can do about it. Obviously, if there's something we can do about it, we try. But in cases where you can't do anything about it, then how are you to encounter that? Well, by enduring it. This is the dignified way of encountering fate. And if one is able to successfully endure it, then that is part of the alchemical process of transmuting that energy, that suffering energy into grace, actually, into the experience of grace. By endurance, a human tragedy is turned into a human achievement through the power of endurance. So living entities who understand some of the cosmic forces that underpin the experience of suffering, such as Daiva, which is being mentioned here. And Daiva is due to Swakarma. If by awareness of the cosmic forces that underpin suffering, then that gives the ability to endure. And by that endurance, you can transform that energy into the experience of grace. Otherwise, you're consumed and destroyed by it. So he's trying to give some awareness to the family of this reality. Having said that, now he gets more closely into the topic of the soul. Very straightforward stuff, so we'll not spend too much time here. Next verse. Nitya atma vyaya shuddha sarvaga sarvavit para dhate asavatmanolanga mayaya vrishtajan gunan. So he's speaking about the nature of the Atma. So he says the Atma is avyaya, the Atma is nitya, eternal. Avyaya means imperishable. And shuddha. Shuddha means devoid of the upadis, pure. Shuddha means this pure awareness, not having any other aspect to it. Sarvagha. Sarvagha means all pervading. Sri Vishwanath says he points this out because he's a demon. So the demons like to think of the self as all pervading. Well, the word Sarvagha means that the soul can live anywhere in the universe, which is how Prabhupada is translated in the word to word. So the jiva has the ability to live anywhere in the cosmos. He accepts bodies that are suitable for those environments, and he can live anywhere. So that doesn't mean Sarvagha. Sarvavit, he has all knowledge. So Sarvavit here means consciousness or awareness. Of course, from the demonic perspective, you may think that the jiva has the capacity for omniscience. And para means transcendental or without the subtle body, devoid of the subtle body. So this is the nature of the soul, is actually pure. It cannot come under the how you say it's not truly suffering. This is what he's wants to make this point. Date asa atmanolinga. However, the soul, he accepts the atmanolinga. So the atmanolinga means the subtle body. The word linga means sign, like a sign pointing to, a particular location. So the subtle body is considered the linga, the sign that is the indication of the existence of the soul. So sometimes referred to as the linga sharira, the subtle body. So although he's transcendent to matter, he accepts the atmanolinga, the subtle body. And this acceptance of the subtle body as the self is maya. This is due to maya, due to ignorance. Maya has the the what do you call as the Jiva part, Jiva Maya part, and Guna Maya part. So the Jiva Maya part, this obscuring self-awareness, it obscures the awareness of one's own nature. And then Guna Maya means the imposition of the body. So like this, due to the Maya, he is accepting this subtle body as himself. Vrishajan Guna. And this subtle body is creating, Vrishajan, the various conditions of experience, right? Experience is in the mind only. There's the experiencer, there's the experience, and then there's the experienced. So the experiencer is consciousness. The experience is mental. It is happening in the subtle body. And what happens when one is in Maya is you conflate the experiencer with the experience. And that is called this asmita in Yoga Sutras, for example, or just Maya. And due to this Maya, all those experiences you take to be you, basically. This is happening to me. Vrishtajanguna, the subtle body is creating all the various qualities and conditions, such as happiness and distress. So he gives an example of this in the next verse. Let's look at the next verse. So yatam basa prachalata taravopi chala iva chakshusha brahm yamane nadrishyate chalativa bhu. He gives two examples. So the first example, he says, because of the movements of the water, the trees on the bank of a river, when reflected on the water, seem to move. So yata ambasa prachalata. It is just like when water is moving. Then taravo api. Tarava means the trees that are on the bank of that water. So you can see the trees on the bank of the water, and the reflection of that tree can be seen in the water. So when the water is moving, it looks like the trees that are reflecting that water are also moving. Chala iva, they are also moving. But the tree is actually not moving. The tree is situated there only. But looking at the tree in the reflection of the water, when the water moves, it looks like the tree is also moving. So similarly, the tree represents the soul, and the moving water represents the mind. So when the water is moving or when the mind is changing all these conditions, the soul is just situated there. You're not actually truly affected, but looking at the soul from the reflection in the water in the mind, so it looks like the soul is also the one being moved by this. That is the analogy there. And another analogy is given where because the sense is moving, the sense object appears to move. So it sounds a little weird here. Similarly, when the eyes move, because of some mental derangement, the land appears to move also. The sense here is the same as the first analogy, but basically your eyes are spinning around, power plus added due to some mental arrangement. So the sense object, like the form that you're looking at, may also appear to be moving around. But the sense object is not moving, just the sense is moving. But because the sense is moving, you actually think that the sense object is, maybe it's something like, maybe a more fitting example of this is, when you've been on the train and one train is moving and the other train isn't moving, but you're looking at the train that isn't moving from the perspective of the moving train. And so the train that isn't moving appears to be moving, but it is not moving. Maybe that is a more easily available example of how we conflate the movement of the sense, the movement of the sense object. But the idea is that actually the sense object isn't moving. So the soul is not being affected. Only the subtle body is being affected. But due to conflation, we take it to be that the soul is being affected, and therefore we're suffering. That's his point. So that was an analogy to describe his point. Next verse. Evam guna brahma yamane manasyavi kalapuman yati tat samyatam padre yalingo lingavaniva. So in the same way, O my gentle mother, when the mind is agitated by the movements of the modes of material nature, the living entity, although free from all the different phases of the subtle and gross bodies, thinks that he has changed from one condition to another. So his point is being made here. Guna brahmyamane manasi avikala puman. The living entity is avikala. Avikala means he's not changing, but his mind is moving. Guna brahmyamane manasi. His mind is constantly changing conditions. Yati tasam yatam badre. So tas samyatam, he takes that movement of the mind to be his own condition. So alinga, although he's without the subtle body in his constitutional position, linga maniba, he is acting as if he's the subtle body. And this way, suffering. All right, next verse. This is the final two verses here of his point. So in his bewildered state, the living entity, accepting the body and mind to be the self, considers some people to be his kinsmen and others to be outsiders. So Aisha, this living entity, Atma Viparyasu, he suffers from Atma Viparya. So Atma Viparya means a reversal and understanding. He is a self, but he takes himself to be opposite. That is the meaning, Atma Viparya. He is a self, he takes himself to be opposite of the self. He takes himself to be anatma. He is atma, he takes himself to be anatma. This is called viparya, like a reversal of self-conception. And alinge, although he is, not the subtle body, linga bhavana, he thinks that he has a subtle body. Okay, so now that he's identified with the subtle body, what happens? Now the fun begins. Esha priya apriya yoga viyoga karma samshriti. So because of the subtle body, he experiences union and separation with that which is unwanted and that which is wanted. Usually that which is wanted, he experiences viyoga, separation. And that which is unwanted, he gets the experience of samyoga. And this way, karma samshriti, he is taking one body after another due to the force of his activities in this material world. Okay, because of this misconception, he suffers indeed the accumulation of such concocted material ideas as a cause of suffering and so-called happiness in the material world. The condition so thus situated must take birth in different species and work in various types of consciousness, thus creating new bodies. This continued material life is called samsara. So this is the first verse, now the second verse. Birth, death, lamentation, foolishness, and anxiety are due to such material considerations. Thus, we sometimes come to a proper understanding and sometimes fall again due to a wrong conception of life. So, sambhavascha vinashascha shokascha vividhashmita. So these are the various conditions of the mind: birth, death, lamentation, etc. And this is due to vivekashmriti. Viveka means discernment, and ashmriti means forgetfulness. Vivekashmriti means he forgets to discern. The sense here is that such a person has the ability to discern, but his discernment faculties become covered over. And not discerning, he is taking the conditions of the mind to be the conditions of the self. And as a result of that conflation, this is why he is suffering. So he's telling, the bottom line is he's trying to tell them to give this up, which is funny because this is his very same problem. The last verse is just, he now says he wants to tell a story demonstrating his point. So usually this is how it goes. You tell some philosophical point, then you tell some story to demonstrate it. So he said, in this regard, an example is given from an old history. This involves a discourse between Yamaraj and the friends of a dead person. Please hear it attentively. So now some story will be told in this regard. So we'll continue the story next time, tomorrow. Okay, we'll stop there, straightforward. It's a reflection. This from Harisham. He says, I appreciate this point more and more about tolerating your fate as I get older. Somehow, as I get older, the youthful and naive illusion that I can shape whatever the kind of life I want for myself is gradually waning. And I'm observing how I'm limited and also blessed in so many ways. And I have to work with and within my limitations. I can't escape reality and create a whole other one based purely on my likes and dislikes. Yes, that's a nice reflection. Thank you for sharing it. Yeah, endurance is the secret to encountering fate and the secret to transforming the experience of suffering due to inexorable cosmic forces into the experience of grace. People usually experience their fate as an oppressor, but they can also experience it as an angel. It just is a matter of the endurance capacity. So spiritual knowledge is meant to give us the fitness to endure that which is beyond our control. But without spiritual knowledge, then the living entity keeps thinking that he's the controller and the enjoyer. So then he is doomed. So long as the living entity keeps thinking, I'm the enjoyer, I'm the controller, and then the living entity is doomed to suffer. And exponentially, there's no getting out of that. So that is why it's so important for people to hear Shastra. Even secular people should hear. In the old world, even Western world, everyone had to learn the Bible. And although the secular world prides themselves on being like humanists, all their ideas of good are coming from the Abrahamic tradition. They can't escape it because they inherited it, generation after generation. So it's so important for people to hear this sort of knowledge in order to traverse through life with a little bit more grace and dignity. Okay, anyone else wants to say anything before we skedaddle? No, please speak up. Siddha.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. So I remember this conversation. I think once you shared this email conversation thread with me, this is regarding some devotee asking you about the crimes or the torture done to the Gurukulis, and how their suffering is a result of their own karma. Because sometimes devotees who are not so dealt with in the ISKCON, in the early years of ISKCON, they feel like the perpetrators must be punished, and they're always against it. But this another outlook here which we have is that fate, maybe there's something which I did in the past, which is why I'm suffering, which is very hard to accept. But at the same time, we see here even Hiranyakashipu is using that thing, as a salve to help person understand it. So then, at the same time, we're supposed to give this philosophy. Then, how do we understand the concept of punishment in a society? How much punishment should be there, and what punishment should be there? How do we reconcile that with fate and retribution?
Someone will say that, well, if everything is fated, then don't worry about punishing the criminal. He will get his due justice in the course of time. So that is also true. But Krishna is also given the Vedas, which give instructions for duties, various types of duties for the living entities. Now, the whole purpose of the duty is to gradually move living entities towards the experience of the self and ultimately the experience of God. It is in order to hold their identity, because in order to move from point A to point B, you need a healthy identity. You can't be walking around thinking you're a cat or a dog, which is kind of popular today. You need a healthy identity. In order to ensure the integrity of the identity, the empirical identity, Krishna has given so many duties for each of the various types of empirical identities. And that is just simply meant to serve as a container for the soul who is ultimately supposed to be moving in the direction of self and God realization. So when someone does some criminal activity, there are duties for the Kshatriya class of man to do something about that. That is also part of the system by which, the system that is meant to hold the living entities in a container as they're moving towards self-realization. So if you do some crime as some Kshatriya, following his duty according to the Vedas captures you and gives you the punishment, then that is also due to fate ultimately. So there's a cosmic force behind that also. But how it manifests in real time, there has an empirically what's the word I'm looking for? I'm going to make up a word. And empirically analyzable. It could be like empirically analyzed. Okay, because of this effect, you've done this action, so this effect is coming. You could measure it to some degree there. But that is also due to his duty. Otherwise, we would need no Kshatriyas. We would need no duties. Just let nature take care of everything. And that is also true. Nature will, in fact, take care of everything. Prabhupada says that is the difference between the laws of God and laws of man. He says the laws of man, you might be able to escape if you're a little bit clever, but the laws of God are so severe that you can't escape them. So nature will end up taking you out either way or one way or the other. But Krishna is also trying to create a system by which souls can move towards the experience of the self and God. And so part of that system is a social system that he gives in order to help contain living entities. So in this way, the two, I guess, can be thought about or reconciled, now that it becomes a free-for-all. If there's too much chaos and there's no set of order, then it would be very hard to focus. And it's very hard to move from point A to point B if it's total chaos. So Krishna is given some order called Varnashram in order to hold the identities of the living entities as they're moving toward a higher goal. Now they've forgotten that higher goal, but in the old world, they knew that there was a higher goal, but they needed something to contain their nature as they're moving toward that goal. So Krishna's given a whole system for that, which includes Kshatriyas giving the punishment for the crime and so on. That's the best I can do with that question. I don't know if you have some other angle.
So, which means that anybody who is designing the laws for whether it be in our society or at the greater level, they have to be very careful, because if you say you overstep, I mean, first of all, in Kali Yuga, you really can't find proper Kshatriyas, but even they are there they have to toe a very clear line, a very careful line, because if you do suppose give somebody an extra too much punishment, you may be the one who will have to suffer the repercussions for it. Yeah. So
I mean, even if you give them the appropriate punishment, you still have to suffer reactions, right? The reaction of being in ignorance at the end of the day. And that's why virtue and vice is considered two sides of the same coin without spirituality. Virtue is really no virtue if you're in ignorance. Virtue is just the mode of goodness at best. And that mode of goodness is also a binding rope for the soul, right? When Krishna speaks about the modes in Bhagavad Gita, he doesn't speak about them positively. When he's speaking about the gunas in the Gita, he speaks about them only in terms of how they cause the bondage, right? So Sattva binds in this way, Rajas binds in that way, Tamas binds in another way. So virtue is no real virtue without, spirituality. So even if you have a proper culture where everything is, giving the right appropriate punishment according to Vedas and so on, still if you are in ignorance, it doesn't matter so much. And then you'll continue on in karma sankshiti. You continue on in samsara. So that's kind of our talking point.
okay, thank you, Prabhu. I appreciate it.
Anyone else wants to say anything before we go? Oh, we can conclude for the day. Some nice statements from Hirani Kashipu. Quotable. All right, so then we'll finish here today then. We'll continue the story tomorrow. Hariom Tatsat. Nitai Gaur Radhe Shyam Jai Krishna Balaram Shri Radha Govinda Ki Jai. Go Premanandi Hari Hari Bol.